Welcome back, guys, to how to build a blog with Laravel. This is part number 12, and this time we're learning about actually storing stuff to the database finally, and also part of that, which is to validate our information before we store it. So we got a lot of good stuff coming up. I'll see you soon. All right, so like I said, the main focus of this video is obviously to finish what we started in the last video of creating. We had a form that we made where we can actually create a blog post and then click submit to create that blog post. We obviously need that to be stored in a database so that it can be accessed every time someone comes to our blog to read. So that's kind of what we're focusing on right now. We created the form and now we're submitting it to the store action on our in our controller. Okay, and the point of this action is basically to save it into the database. So let's go ahead and open up our post controller and take a look at it. Okay, so if we go to app and then HTTP and then controllers, we should find our post controller. This should be nothing new for you guys. Obviously, we had worked on the create action last time, and now it's time to work on the store action. Now the store action is a little bit different because it's coming in as a post request, which, by the way, is why we see this request variable here, is because it's pulling in all the data from the request that might have been submitted with the form. We're going to take that data, we're going to process it, and then we're going to submit it to our database. Now, with any good store request, this is basically the way it would be. You would write the code. The first thing you need to do is validate the data, right? And this is just because we don't know if someone put malicious code in the title or the body of our form. We don't know if maybe they left some information out. It was too long. Maybe we're requiring an email address and it's coming in as not an email address. There's a lot of reasons where we need to make sure the information is coming in as expected, and that's part of the validation process, is we validate it against certain rules to make sure it meets the criteria that we have. We might be looking for a URL, a date, an email address, and we need to make sure that the data coming in matches that criteria. That's what validation is all about. After we validate the data, we know it can go in the database. We know that it's what we are expecting. The next thing we want to do is actually successfully store it in the database. So we would store in the database. And then if that's successful, the third step would be to redirect someone usually to another page. We'll just say another page. Now, in this case, it would probably be either to the read function, to the show, and you would just show them the post that they just barely created. That would be one way to do it. Or you could also send them to the index that would show all of the posts. It all just depends on what you're looking for your application. Okay, so this is basically the outline of what we're going to be doing today, is finishing up this store request, which requires us to do these 3 steps. All right, let's just go ahead and take this one at a time and just start here at the top and get this store function completed. The first thing we need to do, obviously, is validate the data. So let's go ahead here and let's just talk really quick, because I had a little rant in our last video. If you didn't have a chance to watch that, obviously go back and watch it. I've got a link in the description for the previous video. That's where we worked on the create function, this create action up here, and part of that was creating the form. Obviously, I was very upset that they have taken form helpers out of Laravel in Laravel 5. And so that's very frustrating to see that happen as we start moving forward. However, one thing that I will say that's very positive to Laravel is that validation has improved greatly between Laravel 4 and Laravel 5. That's one of the features they focused a lot on, and I'd say it's really easy to work with now. It's actually one of the easiest ways to validate that I've seen out there. So it's super easy, and let me show you how it works. Now, if you remember back at the beginning, one of our first few videos, at the top of our controller, we talked about how every controller extends this base controller class. So it's just a controller class, and it's kind of the base controller. Well, part of that controller is the validation methods, and those are brought in to every single controller we make, and that makes it really easy to validate. So when we want to validate any data, anything coming in with a request, we can validate the data by just doing this and then validate. Okay, and this function here is going to validate the data, and then if We're going to create some rules for it in a second, but if the data does not validate or there's an error, basically what it does is it jumps back to the create function, to the create action, and will post the errors to the create action. So that's kind of the way this works, and it does all this automatically. All we need to do is call this validate function. Now, there's a little bit more we have to do than we've done already because it does require 2 parameters into this function. The first is the request, and so we can just store that as the request variable. And then the second one is an array. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an array, and in this array, we're going to want to, I'm going to go ahead, I'm all out of control here. Let's add some semicolons there, and then we can, the second part, this is this array, and that includes the rules that we want to validate against. Now, validation rules are basically what do you want it, what are you requiring it to do, okay? And this can be anything. Now, well, it can't be quite anything. There are restrictions on the ones that are built into Laravel, and then you can obviously build your own custom validation methods as well. But let me show you, for starters, what's built into Laravel, okay? Okay, so I'll have a link to this in the description, but here's the page that I want you guys to take a look at because it shows all of the validation rules. If you come down here to, under these Laravel documentation, if you come down here to available validation rules, it gives you a list of all the validation rules we have access to right here, right from the get-go without doing any sort of setup. So just to give you a list of some of the most popular ones, we can do accepted, a validation rule for accepted, and this is really good if you have like terms of service and someone has to check a checkbox in order to submit a form. You can do accepted. Oops, sorry. If you click it, it tells you a little bit more about it. But this is great just to make sure someone checked a checkbox and it was checked and they accepted something. You can also make sure a URL is not just a dummy URL, but it's an active URL. That's what this does here. It actually does a quick DNS check to make sure that there's actually a server at this URL address, which is really awesome. You can check it, make sure something is all alpha characters, alpha numeric characters, and stuff like that with some of these awesome rules. You can also make sure that with the after date or the before date down here, you can make sure that a date either happened in the past or is going to happen in the future. So there's a lot of stuff you can do here. You can make sure something is true or false. You can make sure something is an integer. You can make sure something is unique in the database. You can actually make sure, like, for example, an email address is not taken in the database. You can do all sorts of stuff like that. Make sure it's an email and things like that. We have all access to all of these right here. You can see this in the description, again, the link, and you can take a look at all of these for yourself. All you need to do is choose the one that you're interested in, for example, the before date, and you can see how you would write it out, and that tells you a little bit more about how to use it. Okay? So now with what we're doing in our form, we only have 2 form fields. We have the title and we have the body. Now for the title, we just need it to be required. We're allowing spaces, so that's cool. They can have numbers, they can have symbols, anything like that in the title of our blog post. So we don't really need to restrict that. We just need to make sure it's required, or we're going to make sure that something is there, which would mean required. And then the other parameter is, if you remember when we created the database, we used a varchar column type, and it has a maximum character length of 255. So we're going to go ahead and put a maximum of 255 characters on there, just so that people aren't submitting something too large to fit into the database column. Now for the body, we don't have to do that restriction because we have a full text tag column type in there, but we do need to make sure that it's required because when we set up our database, if it's not, we set it up so that the column was required in the database. So if nothing gets submitted there, it's going to throw an error and not be able to create an entry. So we do need to make sure that that's required, and then the title's required, and the title also needs to have a maximum of 255 characters. So it's actually pretty easy for the validation as far as that's concerned. So the biggest one we're going to be using here is the required. I'm going to go ahead and click that. You can see that it tells you here, we're just going to write the word required, and I'll show you where to put that in a second. And it tells you exactly what it does here. The field under validation must be present, and a field is considered empty if any of the following are true. If the value is null, the value is an empty string, an empty array, or an empty object that you can count. And the value of an uploaded file, if you're doing a file upload thing, if there's no path in that uploaded file thing, then it will obviously be considered it'll come back false when we do required. Okay, so that's required. And then the other one we're going to use is max, and max here just allows us to make sure that that there's not too many characters in a string. So let's come back over to our code and take a look at it. So here what we need to do is we just need to set, it's an associative array that we're passing in. The first value just needs to be a name of the field that we're testing. So in this case, it's title, because that was the name of the field. So we can just type title. You remember when we created the form, I said make sure you match your database column name with the name and the text field and so forth. That's to make this process a lot easier. So we're going to say title, and then we're just going to say the title needs to be required, and also a maximum of 255. Now to add two rules together, you just add this vertical bar symbol. The vertical bar, which is above the return key or the enter key, you need to hold shift in order to do it. So you do the vertical bar, and then we're just going to do max, and then a colon and 255. Again, you can see all of this in the documentation, but this is how we would do it. You can stack as many of these on as you want. And it's going to start at the beginning of this string, and it's going to do the first rule first and then the second one and so forth. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then the second one is the body. So let's go ahead and pass in body, and then we're going to say this one is required. And it's just as simple as that. And that finishes out our validation. So we've actually got validation done. That's all it takes to validate something in Laravel, is to just run this validate command like we are here, and then pass in the rules that we want to validate. Now, one thing that's happening behind the scenes that you don't see here is it's also validating to make sure that there's CSRF protection. This is cross-site forgery requests. And I talked about this briefly in the last video, and it basically means when people are on other websites trying to fill in forms and submit them for you with like a bot or something like that. And we don't really usually want this. If you did want that, it would be a very specific scenario when you might want that. But if you did, you can turn CSRF protection off. Go ahead and look at the documentation on how to do that. It's pretty straightforward, but we don't need to learn that here. And so the CSRF protection, when I mentioned in the last video that when we open a form, we're automatically creating a hidden field for the CSRF token. And that all happens behind the scenes. We don't need to worry about it. You don't see it on the front end. And then when we run this validate, it automatically verifies the CSRF to make sure it is valid with that form that we submitted. Okay, so as long as we use the form helpers on the previous page, and then we use this validate here, we're automatically getting the access to that safety feature, that security feature. In addition to that, we're also checking the title and the body. Now, I teach Laravel also, or PHP and other things in person to people. And the one question I get every time I teach validation is people don't like the idea of server-side validation, which is what we're doing here. This is happening with PHP, and the validation doesn't actually happen until you submit the form. And then we're processing the form, and then we got to make we're actually going to redirect them if say it fails, the validation fails, we redirect them back again. People sometimes don't think that that's like a dirty way to do web development, and they always want to go, everyone always asks me, how do we do JavaScript validation? Because it's such a better experience. Okay, and I understand that. I totally agree that JavaScript validation is a much better experience for the user. It's a lot smoother. You can usually stop people and help them get the correct information without them having to actually submit the form, it's awesome in every way. I totally agree, except that you have to have server-side validation in any modern web application. And the reason for that is because we control the validation on the server side. A hacker or someone like that can't turn off our validation on the server side. And that's why it's really important we have validation every time we accept information in Laravel or in any web application. With JavaScript, we can actually turn off, like the client can actually turn off validation if he wants to. And that's one of the main reasons that we got to make sure that we don't solely rely on JavaScript validation. The JavaScript validation is really nice to have. I would add it whenever you have the opportunity to. In most consumer-facing applications, you're going to want to have JavaScript validation to provide a better experience for them. But we can't rely on it because it can be turned off by the the user, and we have no control over that. So we can't rely on the JavaScript. So it's really nice to have. Go ahead and create it because most of your users will benefit from it. But we still need to have it on the server side as well, just to make as like a security protocol. Now, if they've got JavaScript turned on, it should catch any of the problems on their end before it ever gets to us. So then everything should just smoothly go right through. But it's really important that you have server-side validation in any application to protect yourself and your database from malicious code being entered or incorrect values or something like that. And if we have it here in our controllers, we know it's running. If you have it on JavaScript, you don't know for a fact that it's running, okay? So that's why it's really important. Okay, so now that we've got this set up, our validation's correct. If we fail the validation, behind the scenes, this validate command will actually just execute and render us back into the create action, and it does that behind the scenes. So as long as we write code underneath this validate command, we can know that it's only happening if the validation succeeds, okay? That's really weird for a lot of people to understand. It was weird for me at first when I went from Laravel 4 to Laravel 5, because in Laravel 4 we used to wrap everything in like if statements for our validation, but now we don't have to. It's automatic in here. That's one of the things I really like about Laravel 5 is the way the validation's handled. It's super easy. Okay, so everything under here, we can just assume that it's that the validation has succeeded. Now to store stuff in the database, it's actually really easy because we built this model and because Laravel gives us something called Eloquent. Now Eloquent is a way to work with the database without actually having to write SQL code. Now in the past, what we have to do is we used to have to write things like insert, a name into data, a title, name, things like this into database and stuff like that. You don't have to do that, or into posts or anything like that. We don't have to do that anymore and actually write raw SQL code. We can actually do something really cool, which is simply work with a new model object and then just save it with some awesome little methods. Let me show you how easy it is. No joke, how easy this is. So, for example, what we do is we're going to go ahead and create a new instance of a model. So in this case, we're creating a new post. So let's call this instant post. Pretty easy. And then let's go ahead and do, so the post equals new and then just post because that's the object that the model that we were working with. All right, now in the next line, we can start adding things to this brand new post object that we created. So for example, we could do post title equals and set it equal to the title that came in from our request. So we'll just do request and then name, title, just like that. And then we'll also go ahead and do the exact same thing for our description or our body. So we'll do body equals request and body. So as you can see, remember, because we kept the text fields and stuff, the names the same as the database columns, again, it makes it really easy to learn and really easy to follow along with what's happening. It's why it's really important that you do that. All right, and then we can continue doing this to add any other data that we might have and that we've validated into our new object. And then when we're done, we can simply save the object with the save command. So in this case, I just do post and then save and the save method. And now it's going to go ahead and save that new item into the database. Awesome. Now, the last thing we want to do is we're going to want to redirect someone to, say, the show page, which isn't going to show anything. But for right now, that's what we're going to go ahead and do. This is so that they can actually see the thing we just created. If they want to edit it, they can do that. Or they can go back to something else in our application, okay? So we've gone ahead, we've validated, we know it's good, we saved it to the database. The last thing we need to do is actually redirect them. In order to redirect in Laravel, you're just going to do return, and then you can do redirect, and then we're going to do the named route. So we're going to do route, and then posts.show. Now what this does is it obviously redirects them to the named route called posts.show, which goes into right here. Now we know it's called post.show because if you go back to your routes list, which is right here, you can see post.show is right here, and it's going to go to post / and then the number for our posts, right? For the current post that we have or that we want to view. All right, so this is where we get these names. Remember that this is where I come up with these names. So we need to do posts.show. Now there's one thing we got to remember that we haven't done yet, and that's that for this URL, it actually goes to post/ and then a certain ID number for the post, okay? So what we need to do is we actually need to pass in the post number that that we want this page to go to, because if we just go to /posts, it's actually going to go to right here, the get for posts. And we want to go to post/ then the number. So in order to do that, we just have to pass in as the second parameter here, the ID number. Now we could hard code it like number 1, but obviously that's only going to work for the first blog post. So what we're going to do is dynamically fill it. We're going to grab the ID from the post object, okay? So we're going to do post and then ID. And this will take this object here, which will just be saved. It should have a new ID number, and then we're going, or a primary ID, and then we're going to use that here to go to that page. All right. Make sure you add your semicolon. And then the last thing that I just remembered, and this is good before we actually tested the application, is that we're going to get an error when we run this because I call an object here post, or a class that doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is because we need to tell our controller about it, okay? By default, it doesn't load in every single model in our data or in our project, and that's to save on a lot of space. And so we need to explicitly tell it, just like we did up here with these requests and use controller, we need to tell it to use the post model, okay, since we're going to be accessing that. So what we can do is we can just come down here and do use and then app. Make sure you do a / not a /. It's the one above the enter key. / and then post. Just like that, and then your semicolon. And now if we save that, we should be able to actually take advantage of our store method. So let's come back over here, and let's go ahead and go to posts / create. This should open up our form, great, and let's create a new posts. Okay, so now that we've got that, it's the moment of truth. We're gonna create the post, submit it, and sure enough, it actually went into our database, okay? So it went under posts number 2, and I think the reason for this is because I tested this before our, obviously before I make this video, and so the number 1 slot was already taken, and so that's why I have number 2, but you guys will probably have number 1. Now we don't see anything here, and that shouldn't be a surprise because we haven't, it's sending us to this page and there's nothing to see here, and that's what we'll work on in the next video, is putting something up there. But this is what we have right now, which is really awesome, the fact that it's working. Now we can make sure that it works by opening up our SQL Pro. Let's go ahead and do that before we finish the video. So if we come down here to our applications, you can use MySQL Workbench if you're on Windows. We talked about this when we set up our database a couple videos ago. I'm going to use SQL Pro, and I'm going to log into the database and then make sure we access the blog table database that we created. This should give us a whole bunch of the tables that we're working on. And if we look at the post table, you can see here that I actually have 2 blog posts. You'll have 1 probably, but you can create more really easily by just keep submitting your form. So we are saving into the database and it's working perfectly. Okay, so this shows you that everything is working as expected. We've created, now we've stored it into the database. Now it's time to read and update these files, and these are the things we're going to be doing in the next few videos. All right, so our CRUD applications are moving right along, and you're really starting to see how to actually start storing data. And soon in the next video, we'll talk about now pulling it out of the database to display it to the users.